Your snare drum sounds nothing like their snare drum. The wires rattle, it sustains for days, and you're starting to feel like you're ready to throw in the towel on this whole tuning thing. But if you're looking for that ultra crispy gospel chop sound, we have great news for you. We've seen this countless times, and we have also helped countless drummers get this sound that they're after. And we're here to not only show you how to find this, but also customize it to your own personal preferences. So you've seen the videos, you've seen the shed videos, you've seen all the chops. It is overwhelming and incredible, but you're struggling to get that sound, and the higher you tune, the more ring you're getting. This is getting in the way of that clarity you're looking for, that attack you're after, and that ability to play all those notes and have them really speak. It might be starting to feel like this is some kind of well-kept secret that only comes down to you once you can play fast enough. And the truth of the matter is, there are a handful of small aspects to this kind of sound that we're going to dive into today. They're going to get you exactly what you're looking for, along with ways to optimize them for exactly what you need. There are tons of guys that kill at this style, both in church contexts and also in R&B and hip-hop contexts. I'm thinking about people as diverse as Eric Moore, all the way to Thomas Pridgeon or even Sput. They're worth looking up, even if you're not familiar with this style. I don't really play this style in my professional life, but I really enjoy listening to it, and I love getting blown away by their capability. These are just some of the possible references that you could go and check out. The first examples you heard in today's video are fully produced versions of our sound. Now, let's listen to the raw audio of what we have today. Let's begin with talking about the batter head specifically. It's very common to see 2-ply or thicker heads used in this style of drumming for a couple of reasons that aren't readily obvious. In gospel and church drumming situations, you're often dealing with a shared house kit. This means that a lot of different people with a lot of different playing approaches are beating on that kit super hard all the time. This means that a smart choice for that drum set is a durable head, and 2-ply thicker heads are going to offer that. This results in an influence in what we consider to be a standard sound for this style of drumming because that sort of head is prevalent in those environments. An unintended consequence of this setup is that when you crank up a thick 2-ply head into this range, you get a tremendous amount of rebound because it's a lot of material to get tensioned that high. There is also a self-muffling facet to having a thicker drum head that's going to focus the sound, darken it ever so slightly, and control some of the overtones. But don't feel now like you need to go out and get a 2-ply head or something even thicker than that if you don't already have one on your snare. Today, we're not going to do that either. We're using a 1-ply coated head on this drum to get after this sound. Full disclosure, it feels important to say right now, I am not a highly skilled gospel drummer. That's outside of my wheelhouse, but what is inside of my wheelhouse is getting the correct sound, and that's what we're here to do today. So if you want to see blazing chops and a ton of linear craziness, the internet is full of that stuff and it is killing. But here, we're just going to get after this sound so that hopefully you can have it too. Because we're only using a 1-ply head rather than a 2-ply or thicker, we don't have to have the head under quite as much tension to get it into the range we're looking for. It's still offering us plenty of rebound, but it tunes up a little bit easier, and ultimately it's still going to give us enough durability. Let's take a listen to where the pitch of this batter head is right now. There's nothing special or magical about this particular pitch. This is just so you know where we are at today. Depending on the heads you're using, the drum you're using, and the room that you're playing in, you may differ, but this is just a representation of our day today. As far as the snare side head goes, there's nothing too dramatic going on here. It is in a fairly high pitched, but it is not tabletop tight. It still has some tone. Let's give a listen to where we are at with the pitch on the snare side head. If you're a player who tends to absolutely reef the snare side head, we're not here today to tell you not to do that, but rather consider that the sound we're getting today does not include a tabletop tight snare side head. Now let's move on and talk about the snare wires, because this is where we're really starting to actually affect and sculpt the behavior of this drum. Sure, snare wires are meant to give us the sound of snare wires, but they have another job that we don't talk about so much. They are literally the built-in muffler that every snare drum includes, and frankly nobody talks about. If we start to increase tension on these wires past the point that we have decent snare response at low dynamics, they can start to sculpt the whole sound of the drum and tighten up everything into a more controlled sound. In a style like we're exhibiting today, where the snare is primarily about aggressive rim shots, we can actually choke the drum out with the wires and still get an excellent rim shot sound. Think of this as an opportunity to consider your dynamic range of your performances. If you're not playing very low to the drum, we don't necessarily need to concern ourselves with whether or not we have good response down there. Your dynamic range in performance is the only thing that matters here. If the choking of the drum is only occurring below the range that you're playing, we absolutely do not need to concern ourselves with that. This is all about getting a good sound in the dynamic range that you're gonna be playing, and anything outside of that, forget it. But if you want a wider dynamic range out of your drum and you want your ghost notes to speak clearer with some tone and warmth, we're gonna talk about that later on in the video. In addition to the muffling that we're getting from the wires being a little bit overcranked, we need to also talk about a little bit of muffling on the batter head. We're not going for anything dramatic here, rather we want to control what overtones remain after everything else we've done by putting a little bit of muffling right beneath the microphone. A lot of the overtone sound is going into the close mic, so this is a way for us to quell that a little bit without totally killing the drum. Additionally, through experimentation, which we really encourage, we discovered that there was a little bit of zing in the snare wires that we didn't totally love, so we also added a small piece of tape directly over the wires but on the batter head to just minimize that a little bit. We are big believers in little increments with muffling, just like everything else, so that we can understand exactly what's changing as we go. So as you experiment, make sure you're not doing anything too drastic along the way when you might miss something great along. In a little bit, we're going to pull away all of these things so that you can hear a more run-of-the-mill high-tuned snare drum sound and then build us back toward this gospel-specific one. Before we move on to taking all of these facets away, let's talk for a second about the stray harmonics that we're doing all this to control. In the center of the drum, we're not getting a lot of them, but as we start to move to the edge, they become pretty pronounced. Check this out. Even with minimal muffling, they still exist, but I'm also going out of my way in these performances to have a very small strike zone in the center of the drum. If I were to take all of those harmonics away, it would be a dull sounding instrument and also not quite as loud. This means that in addition to these adjustments we're making to the drum itself, we also have to make sure that our performance approach is in line with how we're setting the instrument up. We have called this a gospel sound today, and it's really important to say that inside of a term like that, there's more than one sound. There's actually an infinite amount of sounds underneath that umbrella, and depending on the player, the style, and the preference, anything can fit into that environment as long as it's what they're looking for. We get asked a lot about how to get a high-tuned snare sound. Not just a good one, but a high-tuned snare sound at all. High means more tension. The more tension you add, the higher the pitch goes. It's really as simple as that. How the components of the drum work together at that high tension is a little bit trickier, but we're going to talk about that. To begin to broaden the dynamic response of this drum, the first thing we need to do is reduce tension on the snare wires to get rid of that choking. Let's listen as we reduce tension on those wires while playing the drum at a low dynamic in the center. Did you hear at the end of that demonstration when the tone went away and the crispness of the wires returned and became the most prominent part of the sound? Listen again. These are subtle differences, but in front of you with your drum, they're less subtle than you might imagine, and they also feed into how the drum feels when you hit it. If you find yourself playing in a range that isn't at the very top of your dynamics, this becomes a huge element to getting a good sound. Let's give a listen to this drum now, which is set up for what we consider to be a pretty good high tuning. The sound of the drum now has a fair amount of sustain. It still has sharp attack, but we are getting much broader response from the snare wires, and a lot more harmonic content is coming out of the drum, both with center hits and rim shots. I bet you're wondering how we got here. This is actually the same tuning as the gospel examples before, with the removal of the muffling from the batter head and reduction in tension on the snare wires. That's it. This goes to show you that there is a lot of sculpting that can be done at a given tuning without actually even picking up a drum key. Oftentimes when we're thinking about style-specific sounds or going after a sound that's appropriate for a style, it's a lot closer to something more standard than we might think. It's not necessarily really extreme. From this high tuning, getting us back to gospel, the first step we're going to take is adding tension back to the snare wires until they are sufficiently restricting the resonance of the drum. Let's listen to that. Next, we're going to add the first piece of tape underneath the microphone to start to control the harmonics there. Finally, we're going to add a second piece of tape onto the batter head above the snare wires where they cross to help to control some of the excess buzz we're hearing. With these adjustments, we're now back to our original sound that fits into the gospel environment. We are also now back to largely using the higher dynamic range of this drum because that's where it speaks the best and gets us the sound we're looking for, rather than closer things that are going to exhibit that choking. This style of snare sound is a great example of the fact that there really is no wrong thing to do when you're going after a drum sound. For every time that we've tried to make sure we weren't choking a drum, there are opportunities to use that sound to get exactly what you're looking for. Depending on your approach and your playing environment, or straight up just what makes you happy, don't be afraid to explore the extremes and go against the grain just in case there's something in there that's going to make you happy. We encourage you to explore sound, but not just sounds that you like. It's a much bigger challenge to explore and master sounds that you don't like and make sure that you understand how they're made. It includes ear training, it's a great way to practice, and ultimately it's going to give you even more control over what you're looking for. Finally, don't forget that labels on a sound are meaningless. If you like that sound and it works for you, use it. If you feel things about that label, don't worry about it. If you love the sound, that's all that matters.